There were loud families, difficult families, and then there were the Whitmores loud, difficult, wealthy, and convinced the world existed only to applaud them. Thomas Whitmore was the kind of father who didn't walk into buildings. He entered them with a forceful stride, a raised chin, and an expectation that walls and people alike would move. He had built an empire contracting government projects and believed those contracts made him untouchable, above the rules, immune to consequence. Every courtroom clerk in the state knew his name, not because he was often sued, but because he had a reputation for crushing those who opposed him. He didn't hire lawyers, he bought them. He didn't argue, he issued orders. Everywhere he went, people obeyed. Until today. The courthouse was older than Thomas, older than most of the city, its stone pillars weathered from decades of wind and scandal. It reeked of paper, old leather, and secrets. Whispering employees peeked from glass windows as Thomas marched through security with his patented smirk. He did not notice the court officer's scowl. He did not care that the metal detector beeped and groaned from items he refused to remove. He never removed anything. The rules removed themselves for him. That was the lie he lived in. Beside him walked his son, Daniel Whitmore, 21, anxious, resentful, and so tightly controlled that his spine seemed to curve inward. Daniel was on trial today, not for murder or assault, but for something that scratched Thomas's pride even deeper. Vandalism of federal property and resisting arrest, graffiti, chasing police, running into a restricted building after hours. It was reckless, childish, pointless, but what made it worse was that a Whitmore had been caught, handcuffed, photographed. Thomas wasn't angry because Daniel had broken the law. He was furious simply because his son had embarrassed him. Daniel wasn't a criminal. He was a son suffocating under a father who demanded perfection while giving none of his own humanity in return. He had spent his childhood in a mansion where silence was the loudest sound and expectations were the heaviest furniture, unmovable, unavoidable, crushing. The graffiti hadn't been gang-related or politically charged. It was a message, a desperate message sprayed across a concrete wall near the Capitol building. Let me breathe. Thomas had read that line and interpreted it the only way a man like him could. How dare his son publicly imply he lacked freedom? How dare he humiliate him? How dare he express emotion without permission? So Thomas didn't lecture him at home. He waited for the stage big enough for his sermon, court. Room 301 was packed journalists, gossip-hungry city residents, and a handful of politicians who benefited from Thomas Whitmore's existence. To them, his presence meant money, deals, contracts, protection. Even they sat up straight when he passed. Daniel sat at the defendant's table like someone on the edge of drowning, but afraid of what oxygen might cost him. The door behind the bench opened. The room shifted. Lawyers stood. Judge Elena Marquez stepped through the doorway. Thomas froze, not visibly, but internally, the way the air changes before a storm. Elena Marquez wasn't just any judge. She wasn't easily influenced, intimidated, or bought. She was known for rulings that prioritized dignity over power and justice over legacy. Her dark hair was pinned neatly. Her robe flowed like authority woven into fabric. And her gaze sharp, observant, quietly calculating, took in Daniel, then Thomas, then the hushed audience. She knew exactly who sat in her courtroom. The gavel struck once, crisp and final. Court is now in session. State versus Daniel Whitmore. Her voice held the room without raising itself. Thomas stood as if this was his cue, assuming everyone needed his presence acknowledged. Elena didn't look at him. Mr. Whitmore, she began. You may be seated. It was polite, firm, and deadly. The audience sensed it. The judge wasn't impressed. The prosecutor began. The charges were read. Security camera evidence shown. Witness statements laid out. Nothing was ambiguous. Daniel had done it. Thomas leaned toward his attorney, who looked more like a puppet with platinum credit card strings than illegal. professional and whispered directions, corrections, demands. But something was happening that Thomas did not expect. Daniel kept looking at the judge, not with defiance, but with curiosity, with longing, as if she were the first adult in his life who might actually see him rather than the family name tattooed invisibly across his forehead. Halfway through testimony, while a city officer described Daniel's attempt to escape the police, Thomas suddenly stood, unprompted, uninvited. "Your Honor," he announced, "this is unnecessary. We are happy to compensate the city for this childish misunderstanding," the courtroom murmured. The judge turned her eyes toward him slowly. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied, voice even, "your son is facing a criminal charge. Money does not serve as admission of guilt, nor dismissal of accountability." Thomas's jaw tightened. No one questioned him like that outside his home. "With respect," Thomas said, tone dripping with anything but respect. "Things like this are handled quietly, internally. My family has never needed the state to parent our children." The room stilled. Elena leaned forward, resting her hands. "Yet here we are," she replied. A ripple of stifled laughter moved like a breeze through the benches. Thomas's expression darkened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged publicly. His nostrils flared. He looked for someone to punish. The prosecutor resumed questioning until Thomas interrupted again. "Your Honor, this officer's testimony is exaggerated. My son was frightened, overwhelmed." The judge cut him off. "Mr. Whitmore, you are not counsel. If you interrupt one more time, I will have you removed from the courtroom." Gasps slipped from lips. Remove Thomas Whitmore? People had been fired for less. Politicians had apologized to him for speaking too loudly. Daniel stared wide-eyed. No one had ever told his father to stop. Thomas's attorney tugged at his sleeve in panic, whispering frantic pleas, but Thomas's pride couldn't hear. He stood again. "You may think the robe gives you power over me," he snapped, "but it does not." Silence descended like a curtain. Every heartbeat in the room paused. Judge Elena Marquez slowly removed her glasses and placed them on the bench. "Bailiff," she said, never breaking eye contact, "please escort Mr. Whitmore out of the courtroom until he remembers how to behave in one." The room erupted gasps, whispers, shock so loud elbows tightened and heads whipped around. Daniel froze, and emotion flickered on his face that had no home in his past hope. Thomas Whitmore, the man who owned rooms, was being escorted out of one. And for the first time in Daniel's life, someone stood taller than his father. The moment the bailiff stepped toward Thomas Whitmore, the room no longer belonged to power, it belonged to justice. Justice had standards that money could not negotiate, and Thomas was about to learn that firsthand. He didn't move at first. Shock was a rare visitor in his emotional vocabulary. Being removed for behavior, for tone, was unthinkable. But the bailiff, tall and broad with a presence shaped by 25 years of unruly defendants, approached with calm authority. "Sir, I'll escort you to the hall until the judge calls you back," the officer said firmly. Thomas turned, narrowing his eyes, but something in the bailiff's stance suggested this was not a political fundraiser. These were men who didn't care about wealthy donors or influence. He finally walked chin high, fury tightly contained. The door closed behind him. Judge Marquez exhaled slightly and returned her attention to the prosecutor. "You may proceed," she said, her voice firm but unshaken. The trial continued, but now the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just Daniel under scrutiny. The courtroom seemed to measure the absence of Thomas, and his missing presence resonated louder than any words. Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but it was mixed with confusion. He had never seen his father out of control, never seen anyone deny him anything. It was disorienting, like gravity reversing without warning. The officer on the stand resumed testimony, recounting Daniel's actions that night. Daniel listened as though hearing someone else's story, removed from the shame and fear he had carried alone. When the officer described finding him sitting against a wall, no longer fleeing, Daniel's act of surrender was seen, noted, and weighed by those in the room. "Officer," Judge Marquez asked, "why did the defendant stop running?" The officer shrugged. He yelled, "Just take me, I'm done." Then he sat down. A few jurors shifted in their seats, murmuring softly. The judge looked at Daniel, really looked at him. For the first time, he felt seen and exposed in equal measure. It was a feeling he had never experienced in his home or his family's boardrooms, where appearances mattered more than reality. When the prosecution rested, Daniel's defense attorney rose, straightened his tie, and began the rehearsed monologue about youthful mistakes, stress, and pressure. But every sentence seemed to circle back to one name: his father, his father. His father provided, his father expected, his father believed. Judge Marquez lifted a single eyebrow. "Is this your client's defense or his father's resume?" she asked calmly. The attorney swallowed hard, his confidence faltering under the judge's unwavering gaze. The judge leaned back slightly. There was something unreadable in her expression, empathy carved beneath stone, recognition of a life shaped by forces beyond the defendant's control. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said to the jury, "this court is familiar with defendants shaped by their upbringing. Environment explains behavior, it does not excuse it. Accountability is never inherited. It belongs to the individual." Daniel had never heard someone speak so plainly, yet so wisely, about something he had felt his whole life: that he belonged to himself, that his choices were his own. The judge called for a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, reporters rushed to the hallway where Thomas paced like a caged predator. Cameras snapped, microphones extended, and questions flew. "Mr. Whitmore, how do you feel being removed? Do you believe the judge overstepped? Will you file a complaint?" Thomas ignored them all, eyes fixed on the courtroom doors as if waiting for a moment that could never come. Inside, Daniel remained at the table, alone in his thoughts. His attorney scurried to phone someone, likely a legal strategist orchestrating Thomas's next move. Judge Marquez remained seated, reading silently. Daniel stared at her in fascination until she unexpectedly spoke to him without looking up. "You wrote the words, 'Let me breathe,'" she said softly. It was not a question. Daniel nodded. "What were you asking for?" she pressed. He hesitated. Speaking honestly felt like stepping off a roof with no guarantee of landing. "Space," he admitted finally. "Choices. A life that's mine." The judge's expression did not soften, but something shifted behind her gaze. Recognition? Understanding? A memory of someone who once longed for freedom. She spoke quietly but firmly. "You are young, but youth does not grant immunity. Wanting freedom is not wrong. Damaging property and evading officers is." Daniel nodded, shame and relief mixing in equal measure. Finally, someone, not his father, not an attorney, not the press, was speaking to him like a human being, not a headline. The courtroom refilled. Thomas re-entered when permitted, but he moved with a newfound stiffness. He was no longer a king entering his kingdom. He was a man attempting to reclaim territory he might never truly own. He avoided looking at his son. He never once looked at the judge. When closing arguments finished, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Thomas immediately approached the bench. "Your Honor," he began sharply, "I want to make something abundantly clear. I will not tolerate the tone you have taken with me today." The judge blinked slowly. "And yet," she replied, "here you are tolerating it." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Thomas's voice dropped. "My son will not serve jail time. We both know how these matters are resolved." "I am prepared to," Judge Marquez interjected without raising her voice. "You are prepared to offer the court compensation to influence the outcome of a sentence?" Silence descended like a heavy curtain. Thomas froze. His words had nowhere to hide. "Mr. Whitmore," she continued, "I strongly advise you not to complete the sentence you are attempting. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. Thomas's pride had no brakes. "Your Honor, let's not pretend influence isn't the currency of this building," he snapped. The judge tapped her gavel once not as warning, but as punctuation. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, voice carrying to the entire courtroom, "you are dangerously close to self-incrimination." She nodded to the clerk. "Let the record reflect that Mr. Whitmore has suggested compensation in exchange for judicial influence." A wave of reporters rose like predators sensing open flesh. Thomas's attorney nearly fainted. Daniel's lungs froze. His father's downfall had begun with unchecked arrogance delivered through polished teeth. Outside, photographers captured Thomas demanding phones be lowered while simultaneously posing tall. Reporters chased rumors, attorneys whispered strategies, and Daniel stood alone by a window, staring at a city he had lived in without truly seeing it. For the first time, the air tasted different, less recycled, less filtered. In this courthouse, the only place his father could not manipulate, Daniel Whitmore took a real breath. The kind he had longed for. The kind money could never buy. The jury returned after hours of deliberation, their expressions carefully neutral, but the tension in the room was palpable. Daniel sat rigidly at the defense table, his hands folded, his thoughts racing. For the first time, he realized that the outcome of this trial was no longer just about punishment. It was about freedom, identity, and the quiet rebellion he had whispered into graffiti months ago. Thomas Whitmore stood near the back, arms crossed, eyes darting between the jury and his son. He had regained some composure, but the earlier humiliation still lingered. He glanced toward Judge Marquez, his mind calculating, plotting. Influence was his language. Intimidation was his art, yet today neither seemed effective. Judge Marquez observed the room with measured patience. She had allowed Thomas his moments, but every step, every interruption had been noted and catalogued. The courtroom was a stage, but she was the director, and she refused to be manipulated. She understood that this trial was not just about Daniel's actions, but about exposing the control Thomas wielded. The jury foreperson stood, clutching the verdict envelope, and approached the bench. Every eye followed, every breath held, as the silence thickened. Thomas stiffened, preparing for confrontation. Daniel's stomach twisted, the fear of his father's wrath almost as strong as the fear of judgment itself. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Marquez asked, her voice calm but commanding. The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The envelope was handed over. The judge opened it slowly, scanning the words before looking up. "On the charge of vandalism of federal property, the jury finds the defendant guilty," she announced. A quiet murmur ran through the courtroom. Daniel felt his heart sink, but he reminded himself that the real battle had never been the graffiti itself. It had been the suffocating control, the invisibility imposed by his father, and on the charge of resisting arrest. Judge Marquez continued, "Guilty as charged." Another murmur, slightly louder this time, coursed through the room. Daniel swallowed hard, bracing for Thomas's reaction. Thomas's face darkened, but he held it in check, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The audience watched, some in disbelief, others in satisfaction. Thomas's authority, so often absolute, had faltered publicly. The judge turned to sentencing, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom. This court recognizes that the defendant is young, and his actions, while illegal, were influenced by circumstances at home. The sentence will reflect both accountability and the potential for rehabilitation. Daniel's attorney exchanged a glance with him, a subtle gesture of reassurance. He had expected Thomas to interfere, to attempt to manipulate the proceedings, but the judge's control had nullified him. For the first time, Daniel felt that justice might actually be impartial. Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line. He had never been denied dominance in this way. He had always dictated outcomes, made choices for others, and expected obedience. Today, that power had been stripped, even if only for a moment, and it unnerved him more than any legal penalty could. Judge Marquez continued. The court sentences Daniel Whitmore to 6 months of community service, mandatory counseling, and restitution for the damages caused. No jail time will be imposed, considering the circumstances and his willingness to cooperate. A collective exhale filled the room. Daniel felt a weight lift off his chest. The sentence was firm but fair, and it carried the subtle victory of independence he had longed for. For the first time, he had a tangible sense of agency over his own life. Thomas, however, remained unmoved publicly. His face was an unreadable mask, but his mind was a storm. Privately, he seethed. The sentence had been imposed without his influence, without his signature power. He had lost control, and that realization gnawed at him. Daniel looked up at the judge. Her calm presence had guided the entire process, yet she had allowed him space to experience the consequences and the freedom that came with them. Her authority had created a rare balance between justice and empathy. As Daniel stood to leave the courtroom, he felt an unfamiliar lightness. His father followed behind, but he kept his distance, the usual intimidation withheld. Daniel realized that the dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. The veneer of control Thomas had maintained for years had cracked. Outside the courtroom, reporters and onlookers buzzed with commentary, but Daniel moved through the crowd with a sense of quiet clarity. He had survived his father's shadow in the place where authority mattered most. Thomas trailed behind him, silent now, his usual bravado muted. He could not manipulate the narrative here. He could not bend the judge, the jury, or even his own son. For the first time, he was powerless in a public arena, and the realization stung more than any sentence could. Daniel walked past him, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and relief. The graffiti, the rebellion, the desperate plea for air, it had not destroyed him. Instead, it had begun to carve a path toward independence, one that his father could not fully obstruct. Judge Marquez remained in the courtroom long after the verdict was read, reviewing documents and notes. She understood the complexity of the family at the center of the case and the long shadow a controlling parent could cast. Her measured approach ensured that justice was served, but it also planted seeds of growth and reflection in those who needed it most. As Thomas finally exited the courthouse, his expression unreadable, Daniel lingered for a moment by the window. The city stretched out before him, vast and unclaimed. He had survived the courtroom, survived his father's public defiance, and for the first time, he could breathe with clarity. Daniel realized that the real verdict of this trial was not printed on paper or read aloud. It was the quiet acknowledgement of his own autonomy and the first steps toward a life that belonged entirely to him. He walked out into the sunlight, feeling its warmth on his face, savoring the freedom that had eluded him for so long. Every step was a declaration that he was no longer fully defined by his father's dominance or the expectations of a name. In the shadow of the courthouse, Daniel Whitmore took a deep breath, the kind that filled his lungs and his spirit, knowing that the path ahead, while uncertain, was finally his own to walk. The days following the trial were strange for Daniel. He returned home to a house that looked the same, smelled the same, but felt entirely different. His father moved through the rooms like a storm contained, silent and restrained, as if waiting for some invisible order to be broken. Daniel could feel the tension, the carefully coiled anger beneath the surface, but it no longer weighed on him as heavily. Thomas Whitmore had retreated into his office, behind locked doors and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Business calls were clipped and precise, nothing personal, nothing indulgent. The power he usually wielded like a weapon had been exposed as fragile, limited, and it frustrated him in ways that money or influence could not soothe. Daniel wandered the house, noticing small details he had never allowed himself to see before. The polished floors reflected the sunlight differently now. The chandeliers seemed less imposing. Even the portraits of ancestors, long used as reminders of legacy and obligation, seemed merely decorative. He realized for the first time that the weight of his father's control had distorted his perception of home itself. At night, Daniel lay in bed replaying the trial. The judge's calm authority, the jurors' deliberation, the rare silence when Thomas had been removed, it all replayed vividly in his mind. He felt a mixture of relief, fear, and burgeoning confidence. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. He could no longer ignore the possibility that he had a voice, that his choices mattered. Thomas, meanwhile, did not sleep well. Each night he replayed his humiliation, the gavel's sharp sound echoing in his mind, the sharp words of Judge Marquez that refused to bend to his will. He had lost control in a way he did not understand, and it left him restless, calculating, and angry. He summoned his closest advisors, men who had navigated every courthouse and corporate boardroom with him, seeking counsel on damage control. They offered strategies, ways to influence, subtle manipulations. But Thomas knew the judge could not be touched, and that made him uneasy in a way he rarely felt. Daniel continued attending counseling sessions as mandated by the court. At first, he resisted, assuming the counselor would side with his father or lecture him about obedience. Instead, he found someone who listened without judgment, someone who asked questions he had never been allowed to ask. Slowly, he began to explore the suffocating dynamics that had dominated his life for decades. The house grew quieter over time, not because Thomas had changed, but because he had withdrawn. His presence was still formidable, but Daniel noticed he moved more carefully, measured his words, and rarely raised his voice. It was not peace, but it was a reprieve. One evening, Daniel ventured into the library, a room he had avoided since childhood. It was vast, with high ceilings and shelves that carried decades of his family's history. He ran his hand along the spines of old books, feeling a connection to knowledge and stories rather than power and expectation. He discovered letters from his grandfather, written long before the obsession with wealth and reputation consumed the family. They spoke of responsibility, integrity, and courage, the very things Thomas had never taught him. Daniel realized he could reclaim pieces of himself from these hidden histories, pieces his father had tried to suppress. Thomas called him into the office one afternoon, the first direct conversation since the trial concluded. Daniel approached cautiously, expecting anger, a lecture, or some veiled threat. Thomas's face was unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. "Daniel," Thomas began slowly, "you've tested limits that were never meant to be crossed. You've embarrassed me publicly, and I cannot overlook that." His tone was firm but contained, lacking the usual venom. Daniel nodded, silently preparing for the verbal storm. But it never came. Thomas continued, "Yet, I also recognize that you are not entirely powerless in your own decisions. You acted recklessly, yes, but you acted independently. And that is something I cannot take from you." The words were awkward, strained, but genuine. Daniel felt a flicker of something he had never imagined. Recognition. Not approval, not praise, just acknowledgement that he existed as his own person. Days turned into weeks. Daniel completed community service with diligence, surprising even his court-appointed supervisor. He engaged fully in counseling, exploring his emotions, his desires, and the ways he had internalized his father's dominance. The city around him continued, indifferent to the family drama that had captured national attention. Yet for Daniel, every street, every park, every quiet corner became a place of reflection. A reminder that freedom was not simply the absence of punishment, but the ability to make choices. Thomas continued to maneuver in the business world with precision, but at home, he became a shadow rather than a presence. The household tension remained, but Daniel navigated it with new skill, asserting boundaries he had never dared to define. He began taking small risks, decisions about school, minor purchases, Even friendships, each act a declaration that he could exist outside his father's expectations. Each small victory reinforced his sense of self and reshaped the narrative of his own life. Daniel's relationship with his father was not healed, and it likely never would be entirely, but it had shifted. Thomas's need for control had been confronted and partially resisted, leaving both of them to negotiate a fragile coexistence. One afternoon, Daniel sat by the window, reflecting on the past months. The trial, the verdict, the counseling, the subtle victories at home, it had all coalesced into a new understanding. He was no longer just a son of Thomas Whitmore. He was Daniel Whitmore with agency, autonomy, and a future that could belong to him. For the first time in his life, he felt the clarity of air, the quiet thrill of possibility. The city outside stretched endlessly, full of unknown paths, and he was ready to step forward, carefully, deliberately, and entirely on his own terms. The first morning, after another long week of court-mandated counseling, Daniel awoke with a sense of cautious anticipation. The air in his room felt different somehow, lighter, freer, as if the walls themselves had softened. For years, he had been constrained by his father's expectations, the weight of the family name pressing down like an unmovable stone. Now, though, he was learning how to breathe in spaces that belonged solely to him. Breakfast in the Whitmore mansion had become a quiet ritual rather than a battlefield. Thomas moved through the kitchen with careful precision, offering no unsolicited commentary. Daniel noticed the subtle changes, the absence of constant criticism, the lowered intensity of his father's gaze. While it was not warmth, it was reprieve, and Daniel felt the small victory of space in the most tangible way. As he sipped his coffee, Daniel reflected on the trial's aftermath. He had served his community hours, paid restitution, and faced counseling sessions that challenged him in ways no classroom ever had. Each moment, though uncomfortable at first, was a brick in the foundation of his autonomy. He remembered the graffiti, the desperate plea for air etched in spray paint, and felt a strange mixture of shame and pride. It had been reckless, yes, but it had also been the first declaration of self he had ever made in a life otherwise dominated by his father's voice. Thomas, despite his controlled exterior, was clearly unsettled. Daniel had caught glimpses of it, the slight hesitation before a remark, the careful calculation of words, the moments of silence that were too long to be accidental. His father was struggling to regain footing in a world where authority had slipped from his grasp. Daniel used these moments to explore small freedoms he had long ignored. He made decisions about his clothing, his schedule, and even the courses he wanted to take at university. Each choice was a small rebellion, a subtle assertion of individuality that Thomas could neither fully control nor undo. Outside the mansion, the city carried on, indifferent to the drama of the Whitmore family. Yet Daniel observed it with new eyes. He saw streets he had only ever rushed past, faces that were never blurred by fear, and possibilities that seemed limitless. Freedom, he realized, was not just about avoiding punishment, it was about recognizing potential. At counseling, Daniel began to articulate thoughts he had long buried. He spoke about the constant tension at home, the suffocating expectations, and the fear of existing outside his father's shadow. His counselor listened, asked questions, and offered guidance, but never imposed judgment. For the first time, Daniel felt understood on his own terms. Thomas's presence, once overbearing, had diminished in subtle ways. He no longer hovered at every decision, no longer offered unsolicited advice, and crucially, had ceased attempting to dictate the course of Daniel's personal growth. It was not reconciliation, but it was a truce of sorts, allowing Daniel room to navigate his own life. Daniel found solace in small rituals, early morning runs through the city streets, quiet afternoons in the library, and even casual conversations with friends he had kept at a distance. These moments, simple yet profound, gave him a sense of ownership over his existence. One afternoon, Thomas called Daniel into the office. Daniel approached cautiously, bracing for criticism or reprimand. Instead, Thomas spoke in measured tones, acknowledging Daniel's recent conduct, his compliance with the court's mandates, and, in a strained way, the growth he had observed. It was awkward, lacking warmth, but it was significant. "You've learned something," Thomas admitted, almost reluctantly. "I see you trying to stand on your own. It's unexpected." Daniel absorbed the words, recognizing them as validation of his own journey, rather than praise designed to manipulate. Days passed, and Daniel continued to assert independence in subtle, deliberate ways. He chose courses he genuinely wanted to pursue, dedicated time to community projects that inspired him, and began nurturing friendships outside the sphere of his father's influence. Each choice was a declaration of self, a reaffirmation of the autonomy he had long been denied. At home, the atmosphere gradually shifted. Conversations with Thomas became more transactional, devoid of the constant tension that had defined their relationship for decades. Daniel learned to navigate these exchanges with patience, setting boundaries without defiance, asserting himself without inciting confrontation. The trial and its aftermath had catalyzed a transformation within Daniel. No longer merely a passive participant in his father's narrative, he began actively shaping his own story. The lessons learned through consequence, reflection, and subtle defiance coalesced into a newfound sense of agency. He also noticed changes in how others treated him. Friends and acquaintances responded to his presence with recognition of his autonomy rather than through the filter of his father's reputation. For the first time, Daniel was perceived for who he was rather than as an extension of Thomas Whitmore. Even the courtroom's echo lingered in his mind, the gavel, the judge's calm authority, the moment his father had been removed. It served as a reminder that structures of power could be challenged, that authority could be held accountable, and that independence required courage. Daniel began to plan for the future. He explored university programs, considered career paths, and envisioned a life built around his passions rather than his father's ambitions. The possibilities were daunting but invigorating, and each step forward reinforced his confidence. Thomas remained a looming figure, but Daniel no longer experienced the paralyzing fear that had dominated his youth. He had learned the subtle art of coexistence, of asserting boundaries without provoking outright conflict. It was a skill that would serve him long after the trial faded from memory. On quiet evenings, Daniel would sit by the window, watching the city lights flicker, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The path had been turbulent, filled with fear, rebellion, and confrontation, yet it had led to something invaluable, a sense of self that could not be dictated by wealth, power, or intimidation. Through community service, counseling, and small acts of defiance, Daniel discovered resilience within himself, a strength that his father had never taught him, but that he had cultivated through necessity. The mansion, once a symbol of suffocation, had become a space of possibility. Daniel claimed small territories within it, spaces where he could think, dream, and plan without oversight. It was a tentative claim, but it was his. He knew the relationship with his father would never be conventional or easy. Thomas's need for control was deeply ingrained, and reconciliation would require time, effort, and continued courage. But Daniel now understood that he could navigate this reality without surrendering himself. The trial, once a source of fear and shame, had become a turning point, a catalyst for self-realization, growth, and empowerment. Each day that passed reinforced the lessons learned, embedding in Daniel a sense of purpose that was uniquely his own. By the end of the week, Daniel walked through the mansion with a quiet confidence. He had survived the courtroom, survived his father's shadow, and begun to cultivate a life independent of imposed authority. The world outside waited, vast and unclaimed, and he was ready to step forward. For Daniel, the trial had been more than a legal proceeding. It had been a crucible that forged his sense of self. It was a journey from fear to agency, from oppression to subtle freedom, from invisibility to recognition of his own humanity. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of Daniel's life settled into a new pattern. He woke each day with a sense of measured purpose, navigating responsibilities while carving space for personal growth. The courtroom experience had left an indelible mark, shaping his understanding of authority, consequence, and self-determination. Thomas Whitmore remained a formidable presence in the house, yet his interventions had softened, not because he had changed, but because he had been forced to recalibrate. The once omnipotent father now operated cautiously, as if the trial had reminded him that power had limits. Daniel noticed the subtle cues, the way Thomas paused before commenting, the restrained sharpness in his tone, the rare admissions of acknowledgement. Daniel's counseling sessions deepened, exploring not just actions but emotions, patterns, and long-buried fears. Each session uncovered layers of internalized control, the subtle ways his father's dominance had influenced decisions, relationships, and self-perception. Daniel confronted resentment, shame, and longing with honesty he had never been permitted at home. Outside the mansion, Daniel sought independence in practical ways. He opened a bank account in his own name, planned a university schedule he had chosen, and even joined clubs where his father's influence could not follow. Each act, though small, reinforced the fragile but growing autonomy he had begun to claim during the trial. Thomas noticed, of course. He observed his son's independence with a mixture of irritation, unease, and at times begrudging respect. He did not approve openly, nor did he attempt overt interference. Instead, he measured the environment carefully, probing subtly, testing boundaries, as he always had. But Daniel had grown adept at reading the shifts, asserting himself without confrontation. One evening, Daniel ventured into the city alone for the first time in months. The streets, bustling and indifferent, offered anonymity and freedom. He walked past buildings he had only ever rushed by, noticing details, the interplay of light and shadow, the rhythm of movement, the small unnoticed moments that made life vivid. Each step felt like reclamation of territory that had been psychologically off-limits under his father's gaze. In the mansion, tensions occasionally flared. Thomas's pride remained intact, and he was still quick to criticize when boundaries were crossed. But Daniel responded differently now. He met criticism with calm articulation and reason rather than fear or submission. The shift was subtle but profound, signaling a realignment of power in the household dynamic. Community service continued, and Daniel approached it with purpose rather than obligation. Each interaction with people he helped, each task completed, strengthened his confidence. He realized that accountability could coexist with independence, that responsibility did not require submission to oppression. At home, evenings became a time of quiet reflection rather than tension. Daniel spent time in the library, reading histories, literature, and philosophies he had once avoided, fearing his father's judgment. Knowledge became a sanctuary, a tool to understand himself and the forces that had shaped him. Thomas occasionally attempted conversation about the trial or Daniel's choices. These exchanges were no longer laced with immediate anger or domination, but carried a careful formality. Daniel responded thoughtfully, aware of his own boundaries and able to assert them without inciting retaliation. Daniel began forming friendships outside the sphere of his family's wealth and influence. He sought peers whose value was not determined by inheritance or power. These relationships offered authenticity, and through them, Daniel discovered what it meant to exist independently in a social context without fear or performance. Financial independence remained a distant goal, but Daniel explored it cautiously, learning about budgeting, planning, and self-sufficiency. Each step, however minor, symbolized a detachment from the safety net his father's dominance had provided and the accompanying limitations it had imposed. In private, Daniel wrote in a journal, reflecting on the months since the trial. He chronicled victories, setbacks, realizations, and hopes. The act of writing became both therapy and declaration. He was documenting his own narrative rather than living solely in his father's shadow. At counseling, Daniel began exploring deeper familial patterns, how control, fear, and expectation had shaped not only him but his father. This understanding fostered empathy without forgiveness, clarity without surrender. He recognized that his father's flaws were systemic and learned strategies for navigating them without compromising his own integrity. Thomas, ever the strategist, attempted subtle influence through business and social channels. He invited Daniel to attend meetings and events, ostensibly to mentor him, but the attempts carried undertones of control. Daniel attended selectively, engaging with awareness and learning to negotiate presence versus autonomy. The mansion itself felt different to Daniel now. Spaces that had once been arenas of intimidation became neutral ground. He claimed corners for reading, quiet, and reflection, allowing him to inhabit the home without constant fear or performance. Daniel explored his identity beyond the family name. He joined university clubs aligned with personal interests, took on creative projects, and engaged in community discussions that challenged and expanded his worldview. These activities nurtured independence, confidence, and the beginnings of authentic self-expression. He also confronted lingering resentment toward his father, acknowledging anger without allowing it to dictate actions. Each confrontation, internal or external, was tempered by reflection, a skill he had begun developing during counseling sessions and courtroom experiences. The trial's lessons continued to resonate. Daniel reflected on the moment Thomas was removed, the courtroom's authority, and the judge's impartiality. He understood now that power could be challenged and influence could be resisted when exercised with awareness and courage. In family interactions, Daniel exercised patience and discernment. He engaged when necessary, withdrew when prudent, and gradually built a rhythm of coexistence that preserved his autonomy while minimizing unnecessary conflict. He began planning for the future with intention. University applications, career options, and personal goals were no longer abstract or dictated. He made choices grounded in self-knowledge, curiosity, and practical foresight. Thomas continued his business dealings, but Daniel's presence no longer required mediation or constant control. He moved within the household as a separate entity, capable of negotiation and agency, while Thomas adapted to the boundaries he could not fully overcome. Daniel's awareness of his own capabilities expanded daily. Each successful assertion, each small accomplishment, reinforced confidence and a growing sense of self that had been dormant for years. Evenings brought reflection, often by the window overlooking the city. Daniel watched the movement of people and lights, appreciating the freedom of observation without interference. He felt gratitude for autonomy, awareness of responsibility, and the exhilaration of emerging adulthood untethered from absolute domination. By now, Daniel's sense of agency was undeniable. He had transformed the trial's aftermath into a foundation for independence, weaving resilience, awareness, and courage into his daily life. The path ahead remained uncertain, but he had discovered the capacity to navigate it intentionally. In the quiet of his room, Daniel allowed himself a rare smile. The courtroom, the graffiti, the confrontation with his father, all of it had led to this moment. He was not free in every way, but he had achieved something more lasting, the knowledge that he could define himself step by step, choice by choice.